You're listening to The Pulse on AMI Audio. I'm your host, Grant Hardy. Once a week, I'm going to speak with advocates from around the disability community about the topics that matter most. If you're listening on AMI Audio, today's episode will repeat every 6 hours until tomorrow, plus our show is available wherever you get your podcasts. Today, I'm speaking with David Lepofsky, the chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act Alliance. David is a retired lawyer, has been awarded to the Order of Canada, Order of Ontario, and is in the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame. And today he's going to be speaking with me about the 30th anniversary of the AODA Alliance. David, thanks so much for joining us. Can you start by telling us about your role on the AODA and what inspires your work?
Well, I'm chair of the AODA Alliance, and I have been since 2009. So I kind of lead the advocacy efforts, and we're a virtual committee. So it's not like we have meetings with hundreds of people approving agendas and stuff. We put out the ideas, and people jump into action as they see fit. And what drives me is this is a volunteer role, and I've always obviously cared a great deal about the goal of accessibility and full inclusion for people with disabilities. I have the good fortune that after a very enjoyable career as a lawyer with the Ontario government, I retired, and I've got time. And I've always done volunteer advocacy outside my job, but now I've got even more time. And I think it's important to do. And frankly, I enjoy doing it. I love meeting the people involved in this kind of advocacy. And my greatest joy is when I meet people of all ages who take our ideas and run with them, pardon me, and then come up with their own ideas and do even better.
Well, that leads us in nicely to your 30th anniversary coming up. Maybe before we get into the event, you can give us a brief history of the AODA.
So the prehistory is 1982. And in 1982, we won two important rights, and it was a result of disability advocacy. One was we won inclusion of equality for people with disabilities in the brand new Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And if our listeners want to learn about the story of how we fought that battle, I've written a memoir about it. It's free. It's online. It's downloadable for free. Just Google Swimming Up Niagara Falls. That's the name, Swimming Up Niagara Falls. And you can just download it for free and read it. And I called it that because our chances of success were about as small as it would be to swim up Niagara Falls, but we succeeded. Here in Ontario, we also fought to get disability included in the Ontario Human Rights Code, which prohibits discrimination in access to jobs, housing, goods and services, and so on. And after these great victories, over time, it became evident that while they were great laws on the books, they were not actually changing enough government and private sector practices. People with disabilities still face barriers. So a number of us in the early 1990s, inspired by the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, a number of us decided that what we need is a new law, not to replace the Charter or the Human Rights Code, but to implement them so that we didn't have to fight barriers one at a time privately in individual cases. And what happened was, in early 1994, Ontario had a new Democratic government under Premier Bob Rae, who was an NDP, he's now Liberal. And a backbencher in the NDP caucus named Gary Malkowski, who was the only deaf MPP in any elected legislature in the Western world, he decided to introduce a private member's Disabilities Act to fulfill our goal of a law that will implement our charter and human rights. And it was a private member's bill, so the government wasn't backing it.
Mhm.
But after some backroom lobbying, it came to a standing committee at the Ontario legislature for hearings. And the first day of those hearings was the 29th of November, 1994. Just a week ago, or a week from now, will be the 30th anniversary of that date. And a number of us, individuals with disabilities, went to watch those hearings to see what was going to happen. And the minister responsible for this area spoke to the committee and was incredibly patronizing and evasive.
Mhm.
And our blood was boiling. And we weren't an organized group. There was just 20 of us. We knew a number of us knew each other. And after this outrageously infuriating meeting of a standing committee, word got out among us, let's go meet down the hall. I think Gary Malkowski had grabbed a room for us. And we all got in a room. And Gary, speaking to us through a sign interpreter, got up in front and said, we got to start a movement. We got to start a coalition to fight for this law. Now, remember, he's the MPP who brought the bill in for debate. And so it started right there. Now, I will tell you that I had not the slightest idea that I was going to take on a leadership role. Like, not a clue. And in fact, I've joked since then that if I'd known what I was getting myself into, I might have not gone in the room that day, just because a lot of work ensued.
Sometimes those are the best leaders, really, where you just kind of stumble into, not stumble in, but
Stumble is the word.
you
I,
find that
I
the
would
position suits you well.
I would say bumble and stumble. And as the memoir I wrote about the Charter of Rights, swimming up Niagara Falls shows, I in that campaign and this one, I started out not having a clue what I was doing. In fact, none of us did. But we formed together, and we didn't know what the heck to do next. But over the next month, we started formulating principles, got together. Eventually, we had three co-chairs, and then two of them eventually opted to step down, though they still supported the cause. And I carried on for the next decade as the chair. We were then called the Ontarians with Disabilities Act Committee because we said the law we wanted was the Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So, in a nutshell, we fought for years. Ontario in 1995 elected a conservative government. Now, we're nonpartisan. We work with anybody, but it was a conservative government under Mike Harris. He promised a Disabilities Act, clearly did not want to deliver on the promise.
Mhm.
Brought in an incredibly weak bill in 2001. It was the last bill passed under his term as premier. It was incredibly weak and ineffective. But we then continued on with our battle and asked the parties to commit after that, if elected, to pass a stronger law. The NDP said they would, the Liberals said they would, the Tories didn't say anything. And in 2003, Ontario elected a new premier and a new government, a Liberal government under Dalton McGuinty. And Premier McGuinty kept his word. He worked with us closely. His government worked with us. They developed a bill. It was passed in 2005. It's called the the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or AODA. It was a good law, and they worked collaboratively with us. Didn't include everything we wanted, but it was a substantial improvement on the earlier weak law passed by the Tories under Mike Harris. The law required on the Ontario government to lead us to a fully accessible province in 20 years. Well, that deadline's coming up in a month.
Mm.
And unfortunately, while the government got a good start on implementing the law, um, starting within months or a couple of years after the law was passed, the foot dragging began, and the foot dragging continued, and it slowed down and slowed down. And
Yeah,
right now,
of course.
progress on accessibility is not only grossly inadequate, but it's glacial.
Mhm.
Now,
And that,
that's not to say we've done nothing, but we have not accomplished anywhere near what we should.
and honestly, the what you have accomplished is incredible, just in the sense that, as a millennial, some of these rights and laws that you're talking about, I would have just said, well, of course, I just take it for granted. It's obvious that we should have that. But we really forget about those people, really working behind the scenes to ensure that someone like me just has a good normal, reasonable life. So just want to extend a thank you to you for all of your work and advocacy. And even though it may be moving at a very glacial pace, it would be moving much slower or not at all without those folks like you really advocating
Well,
for
and,
us.
I want thank you very much, and I want to emphasize that your thanks are owed to and are expressed to not me, an individual, but a whole group of
Of
people, some of whom
course.
did not live to this day. They've passed away since then, but a whole lot of people, grassroots advocacy. And that's what we're continuing to this day. When the AODA was passed, the ODA committee that I chaired was finished its work. Its mission was to create a law. We got the law passed.
Mhm.
So we closed up shop. But before we did, I reached out to some key players in the disability community. I said, we're going to be wrapping up. We're going to need a successor watchdog to oversee, pardon me, to oversee progress. And that was the birth of the AODA Alliance.
Mhm.
I initially had said I would not take a leadership role in it. I didn't want to. I thought it was time for me to step back and to engage others. And some good people stepped up and were doing some good leadership. But in 2009, I was approached by them, tasked to step back in, and I did. And I've been continuing since then. And our role is to try to get the government to effectively implement this law.
Mhm. So I'm just curious. Over the years, now obviously, you you have a background in law. I'm sure there are many other, very accomplished other people as well that are collaborating. But do you find that there's more collaboration with governments, with lawmakers, or is it a little more towards the litigation side overall?
Well, let me start by saying that we've are always been and we continue to be a grassroots movement. So that yeah, there are lawyers involved, but the vast majority of people have no training in law. People just like those listening to us right now, people who care, people with disabilities, people who have not got a disability because they'll probably get one later, uh, everybody. And that's what's made a difference. And in fact, it's incredible around the province and other parts of the country who I've met doing advocacy in their provinces, unconnected with us, that people, there's been a huge reform and one that we were hoping for when we won the charter disability amendment in 1980, which was indeed what you said, a generation who would see themselves not as charity recipients,
Mhm.
that's what I grew up with,
Mhm.
but as rights holders, and with not handout palm ups, handout stretched, please, but rather these are my rights. What are you doing to implement them? And that transition has happened, and it's incredibly important. Um, Collaboration versus litigation. When you fight a war, like a military war, any country is going to use all the tools available: their ground army, their Marines, their Navy, their Air Force, cyber warfare, espionage, propaganda, and diplomacy.
Mhm.
Now, we're not in a military conflict, but we have a range of tools: public persuasion and political pressure, um, collaboration with public servants and opposition parties and the government, and also litigation. Now, litigation is not what the AODA Alliance does,
Mhm.
but there are other people who do. And I can tell you, I brought some cases myself personally. In 1994, I decided as a blind individual that it was absurd that in Toronto, our public transit, the TTC, did not announce subway or bus stops. I brought a claim to force them to announce subway stops. I eventually won in 2005. I brought a claim after that to force them to announce subway stops. I won that in 2007. Um, and I've done some others, but my main avenue is uh, working with the ODA committee for our first 10 years and now with the AODA Alliance, its successor, to engage in political pressure. It's nonpartisan. We'll work with anybody, government and opposition. We'll work behind the scenes and we'll work appearing at government legislative hearings. you name it, we do it. And
Fair
it's
enough.
not a question of one or the other. There are tactical. I just gave a talk to a law class this morning because I teach part time in a couple of law schools here about
Mhm.
this stuff. And I was asked about choosing between one or the other, like when to use one and when to use the other. And it's a complicated decision with a whole lot of tactical considerations.
Yeah. Exactly. Fair enough. And again, wow, just thinking about all that you said, as a millennial, my buses, my subway stations, SkyTrain have pretty much been announced for as long as I can remember. And my annoyance is sort of like, oh, the one day when maybe the system isn't working, versus again, just taking for granted that other people didn't have this at all growing up. So that's really major stuff. So again, have to thank your group for the advocacy you've done. So let's talk about your event on November 25th. Can you tell us a little bit about the event, the celebration, and what's taking place?
Okay, well, we remember fondly the day back 30 years ago when we couldn't have imagined what we were getting into. And it's, if anybody knows the history of the French Revolution, it was kind of like our tennis court oath, the storming out and forming this new coalition.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so we want to go back to where it all began. So what we're doing is we've booked a room at the Ontario Legislature at Queen's Park for next Monday, the 25th, from 2 to 4 p.m. And we're staging what we're calling community public hearings. The legislature will hold public hearings on legislation. You'll have members from each of the political parties. They'll invite people to come and present. Well, we're doing it ourselves. So we've invited all the parties to send an MPP to listen. And we've invited people with disabilities to plan to speak, either in person or on Zoom. And we have a sign up. I think all our time slots are booked, but we're taking wait list requests because some people won't show up. That's always the case. And we're going to invite people to basically say, what barriers do you face now, and what do you think the government and the legislature should be doing about it? And as a result of that, we are going to come forward um, with a proposal to all the political parties in light of the fact of two things. One, the fact that January 1st is coming and the AODA's deadline will have been, missed. That doesn't mean the law is over. It just means the government hasn't lived up to it. But also, even though Ontario has a fixed term election and our next provincial election is supposed to be in 2026, there are huge rumors that the Doug Ford government is going to call an election next spring. And what we do months before any election is we write the parties and ask for commitments on accessibility. So between this anniversary and this event and our accumulation of experience, we aim to come out with our letter to the parties saying, in light of the failure to meet the AODA's deadline, how about making these commitments about what you would do if elected? So that's the plan.
So, how are you feeling about the my understanding is that all parties have been invited to send a representative to the event there on the 25th. Just curious how you're feeling, in general about the current level of government representation that you have so far.
Well, in terms of engagement with the current government, we have openly said that the Ford government's record is abysmal on
Mhm.
this on accessibility, and they've had many opportunities to get it right. We've offered them lots of ideas. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, has repeatedly refused to ever even meet with us. He's the first Premier in 2 decades who's done that. Every other premier over the past 2 decades, we've not only met with, but met with several times and had constructive, positive meetings with. And I emphasize we're nonpartisan. We're not out to elect or defeat anybody. We'll work with anybody. If they do good things, we commend them. If they do bad things, we criticize them and urge them to improve. And we did that with each of the two prior premiers, Kathleen Wynne and Dalton McGuinty. And we will do that. We do that with the federal government, same thing, even-handed. But this government is basically has had very, very minimal engagement with us. We will still reach out to the public service, and public servants will meet with us or have met with us a number of times. But the decision makers are largely like the ministers and so on. It's been pretty minimal. The minister for accessibility, we've had one gentleman who's the minister of accessibility since the Ford government was elected in June of 2018. His name is Raymond Cho, and several meetings with him early on. And he and I get along well, but in the past 3 years, declined every request to meet. I ran into him when CNIB did a kind of a lobby day at Queen's Park, and we had a lovely chat. But a hi, how are you? What's new kind of conversation. But that's it.
It's just sort of interesting, isn't it, when you think about all those statistics we've heard, how many people either have or will have a disability or will have important contact with someone who does. Like, we really should be a very powerful group of voters, and somehow we just need to either unify together or let those decision makers understand how powerful we are. And I guess that's, again, one of those things that our advocates are doing for me, but behind the scenes.
Well, this is where all our listeners and you can help, because if anybody listening to us from across the country can, for free, sign up to get updates from the AODA Alliance. We send them out by email. Now, a lot of them are Ontario focused, though several focus on federal issues. But every one of our updates, as often as we can, I should say, we will include updates on what's going on, but then a heading entitled How You Can Help, with some practical tips on what you could do just sitting there right at your keyboard to help us out, to help add your voice to ours. If you want to get our up, and if you're in another province, you could borrow these ideas and use them on your own government. And to get our updates, you go to our website, which I'll give you in a sec. And right on the homepage, there's a sign up link. You click on it, you paste in your email address, and boom, you're done. So the website is www.aodaalliance.org. AODAalliance.org. So please sign up for our updates.
So this is going to be fantastic, really great event, and hopefully folks out there can help either get the word out, share their ideas, whatever it is. I just wanted to ask you, when you think about the future of accessibility in Ontario and Canada, what are your dreams?
Whenever I cross the border to the US, I feel like I've traveled into the future. When I come back to Canada, I feel like I'm going in a time machine into the past. So last week, my wife and I went to New York City for a few days, just for a bit of a break. And I remember in the 70s, I think, getting into a taxi in New York City, their famous taxis. And on the back seat, the back of the front seat, there's always a print picture of the driver and their name and their license number and what number to call if you think they stink as a taxi driver and you want to complain. Well, I remember it could be 30 years ago, could be even 40 years ago, that I happened to touch that and there was Braille there. I thought, oh my God, that's so easy. Well, since then, lately, there is some taxis will have a little screen and there's advertising running and stuff. Well, I get in the back seat of a cab a week ago in New York City, and there's a screen there, and I hear it saying, for accessibility features, touch the center of the screen. I touch the center of the screen, and next thing you know, it's reading out all the menu items, including what button to push to know what fare you're at. And then when you're finished the ride, it'll automatically tell you what the total fare is. I figured, my God, the technology exists. It's so easy. And like, why can't we do this here?
And it's just everything from credit card readers to taxis to those screens and the airport terminals to just all these things that should be so easy, but for whatever reason, it's been this massive riddle. And like you, I'm sure I love our country, but man, uh, we have some work to do in terms of accessibility and inclusion.
Well, that's why people need to go to aodaalliance.org, sign up for our updates, and start posting them, or follow us on Twitter. I still call it Twitter, AODA at AODA Alliance, and retweet our tweets.
So, David, best of luck with the event there on the 25th. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Great to talk to you, and I hope we can do it again.
I'd like to thank David Lepofsky for joining me today and the incredible work that the AODA Alliance is doing. If you're interested in signing up to take part in the event for the 30th anniversary of the AODA Alliance, please visit the AODA Alliance website at www.aodaalliance.org. AMI Today and The Pulse will repeat every 6 hours on AMI Audio and is available to watch again as soon as the show is over on YouTube. Plus, you can find The Pulse and AMI Today wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Grant Hardy. Thank you for listening.